Okay, so thank you for turning up. There are many talks and many wonderful activities going on here. I think we should first have a word from our sponsor. This is John Tradescant, as you see, lately deceased, actually a few years ago. And you unfortunately cannot see this picture because it is in storage. But you can see him alive, so to speak, but he's still dead, okay? But this is him dead, and he's still dead, but you can see him alive in gallery number 9, I believe. So the title of this lecture is, Who Owns Your Face When You're Dead? Well, what a stupid question. You're dead, so you don't care about it, okay? You're dead, and you're not going to have a face very much longer, okay? If you're dead, your face is, alas, going to go. But let's pause a moment. The face is, after all, a rather special part of the human anatomy because it identifies us more than any other part of the body. Now, this is a famous rhyme that apparently nobody knows who actually was the first to speak it, but it's always attributed to the President Woodrow Wilson, and I think that's good enough for us, okay? So that's the face of, is obviously something particularly important if you're interested in the issue of who you actually are. Now, my interest in this subject emerged, as the introduction suggested, from my research into the history of identity in the 19th century. And this is the chap who got me interested in this question. Otto von Bismarck and his face, although I'm afraid not the top of his head, and this is before his death. He's dead. It's 1898. This is Bismarck on his deathbed. I think you will admit, not such a glorious figure. Now, he was photographed on his deathbed. This is an illegal photograph taken in 1898 by two freelance photographers called Wilke and Priester, who snuck into his deathbed room in his Schloss outside Berlin and took this illicit photograph. They then quickly retouched the plates to something a little more acceptable and haired back to Berlin to try to flog it to the newspapers. The family, Bismarck's son and the rest of the family, were absolutely furious. Bismarck had always been very careful about cultivating the circulation of his image when he was alive, hence that rather wonderful picture that we saw at the beginning. And they wanted to recover the photographs and the plates, they wanted to forbid their reproduction, and they wanted the stuff back in their own hands. But the big problem was, what law exactly had the photographers violated? Could they have got the consent of the dead Bismarck to be photographed? Not likely. Whose rights were being violated? This is a dead person. Does the dead person have any rights? Bismarck, after all, couldn't have given or withheld consent to being photographed, and the publication of his face was also not anything under his control because he was dead. He couldn't give the answer yes or no. And also, although people have rights, personal rights, rights of reputation and so on, those are also only available when they're alive. And he has no legal identity and no legal status when he's dead. So this is a very complex case in German law, and I think you'll probably be very happy to know that I'm not going to go into it any further, than to say that it did turn on the question of how you could establish whether you have a right to the image of your own face. And of course, the killer, or the kicker, perhaps killer is the wrong word here, in this is it's the image of your face that you might have some control over. It was a landmark case. It took a long time to go through all the German courts, but by the end of the case, and with changes in the law on photography that followed subsequently, it was a very important case in the German law establishing rights of privacy, rights of personality, in other words, sort of who you are, exactly what your face represents you as, and on the question of copyright. Since then, and this is of course over 100 years ago, the importance of the face has been legally recognized and protected in European law. This is just one of the most recent judgments on the matter. And you can see a person's image constitutes one of the chief attributes of his or her personality, as it reveals the person's unique characteristics and distinguishes the person from his or her peers. It's you, it's not the person next to you. The right to the protection of one's image is thus one of the essential components of personal development, by which they mean exactly what it says, who you are. In other words, it's an essence of who you are. And if you were here at the at the lecture just now, the Roman law lecture, this question of the identity of the dead and the identity of the person was very prominent in that. So let's look at the situation in the present day in this country. We'll hop across the channel from Germany, and of course we're bound by European law. While you're alive, you can own and protect the right to the image of your face. It can't be used without your consent because you've got a right of privacy, or as the Americans put it in a most important case, the right to be left alone. So on the one hand, your right of privacy allows you to protect your face so that, for example, I have just signed a waiver saying that I can be photographed for a podcast of this lecture. Okay, you don't have to do that because the camera's behind you. So don't turn your head because otherwise you may be in trouble. But actually, even so, if you're photographed in a public place, and if your photograph is just you in a public place, the law is a little more lax at that point. You cannot necessarily protect the fact that your image turns up in a crowd because the photographer has not been photographing you, but photographing the crowd, and so your rights are a little less secure in that case. You have not only a right of privacy, in other words, a right to control the circulation of your image, but a right of what's called publicity, a right to control the commercial use of your face. Now, when you're dead, what happens to those rights of privacy and publicity? Well, one man who prudently thought ahead, and you may have read about this, I think this was earlier this year, was Robin Williams, who, and this was a first in American law, he embargoed any use of his digital image for 25 years after his death. He did this last year. As I say, this was a first. This established a precedent. Whether it's going to be tested in the courts, I don't know. But he knew how easy it is to master a digital image and to put it into some other context. So he said, you can't just do that for me. Even though I'm dead, my face, the rights to my face are going to be protected by a charitable foundation which he had established in his name or in the name of his face. And that foundation has the right to give or withhold permission, and any royalties will go to the foundation. I don't know what the foundation, what their charitable purpose is. But anyway, there was a thoughtful chap, and you can see he's pretty determined about it. Now, these are images still, so let's get back to the important question for this evening. What about the body part? Well, here is the situation. You cannot own your face as a thing, as property as such. While you're alive, you can't own your body, nor can you own any part of your body while it's attached to your body. Okay? Now, the question of what happens to parts of you that are detached from your body is rather more interesting. And actually, it's in that sphere that most of the issues of ownership have circulated. In other words, cells. Well, actually, in the 19th century, hair. A lot of questions about once your hair had been cut off at the hairdressers, did the hairdresser own your hair? And of course, hair was used for a lot of purposes in the 19th century. Or did you own your hair? And there are some court cases in the 19th century, at least in Germany, about establishing whether your hair, once it's been taken off your head, I see hands moving rather kind of nervously to the top of the head, whether it's yours or not. And in fact, most of the law that circulates on questions of who owns detached body parts are really not about your ownership. They have to do more with the question of the let's say, the medical or research companies that have bits of your cells or other bits and pieces of people's bodies, and what is their status, what is their legal status, are they owned? There was an interesting, how shall I put it, a very interesting case that turned on this question, and perhaps my learned friend here will actually know what this case was a few years ago. In 2005, a defendant in the English courts was charged with possession of a firearm because he had concealed his hand in his jacket so that it looked like a gun. Okay, ring any bells? I'm speaking to my legal counsel here, who's conveniently situated in the front row here. So the question is this a gun in his pocket or, okay. Or was he pleased to see you? Not so pleased to see you. Were you pleased to see him? Here's the judgment. It's a fabulous judgment. It's the kind of judgment that makes us have real faith in the law, because it really gets down to the nitty-gritty, to the nub of the matter. Okay? Let me just return you to this picture. This, by the way, is not a real gun. It's a real hand. But as far as we know, every part of the hand is attached to the person's body. Therefore, he cannot possess it. You can't possess something which is separate or distinct. Therefore, the man could not be charged with possession of a weapon, okay, because he didn't possess it. It was part of him. The fact that it was his hand or his fingers, too bad. That's the situation. I do not know. This is the House of Lords judgment, so this is pretty high up. I think the case would have to have... Could it have been heard again? I don't know. Did he get off scot-free? I don't know. But anyway. Well, Lord Chilcot still hasn't reported. Okay. But as I've said, UK law is moving closer to recognising your ownership of detached body parts or of biological material like cells. And if you remember, there have been a lot of cases of, this is a rather serious note, a lot of cases where parts of bodies have been removed for medical use. And it was especially poignant in the case of children. If you think of I think it was the Alder Hey Hospital case, where parts of children's brains were removed before and parents had not given permission for that to happen. So things like preserved tissue, sperm, these issues are important and are being covered in contemporary law, but the main point is that it's not usually your ownership. It does happen that somebody's ownership becomes a matter of legal inquiry, but it's usually that it's bits of you that have been taken over by somebody else. Now, when you're dead, it's another matter. The English law for very many years has established the no property principle in the unburied corpse. Nobody owns a corpse. The law says that somebody can be in possession of a corpse and can require possession of a corpse, but only in order to bury it. And that point of possession is not the same of property, okay? So the corpse simply belongs to nobody, okay? But there are people who have a claim on the corpse in order to bury it, and that claim is a claim to possess the corpse for the act of burial, but they don't actually own it. Again, there is a wrinkle in the law here. You can own a body or part of a body which has been transformed from what the law calls a mere corpse. Actually, I see a mere corpse sitting in the back row there. Shall we test it on him? Perhaps this applies to you, sir. You can own a body or a part of a body which has been transformed from a mere corpse by skill into something else, into something which is not just a corpse, by preservation. Is that your secret? It could be. So in other words, if somebody has exerted skill to do something with the body other than just leave it as a corpse, that could create a right of ownership. And let me see if I can remember this. I haven't got this in my notes. But there was a very important case in the late 19th century, and I think it was a British or American case, which is always cited in the legal textbooks, which had to do with a body that was, I think, on display at a fairground, something like that. It might come back to me in a moment. But anyway, that established the principle that if a body or body part has been preserved, then it could become, I know what it was. It was Siamese twin or conjoined twin fetuses. That's right. And the question was whether they could have been stolen, I believe, because they could not be, under one reading of the law, an actual piece of property. But the court case decided, the judges decided, or they ruled, that because the conjoined twin fetuses had been preserved by skill, by human skill, they were no longer a mere corpse. They were something else. Now, this leaves what I can only describe as a burning question unsolved. What is the status of your ashes? Well, we don't know. We don't know whether, I don't know whether this has been tested in law. I suppose that ashes, my experience of ashes, which so far is not, I'm happy to say, direct, but indirectly my experience of ashes is that they normally arrive in an urn of some kind. So perhaps the urn itself could be deemed to be stolen rather than the ashes. So, in conclusion, you don't own your face. Okay, you can, under certain circumstances, own the rights to images of your face, but you can't own the thing itself. But let's not leave it at that. Let's remember that you can now, just recently, in the last few years, it's become possible to get, or receive, or give a surgical face transplant. In fact, has anyone here seen the movie Face Off? Yeah, okay. I only was told about this after I had written this lecture, or this talk, and I hadn't had time to look at it. I just saw the trailer for it, which I had hoped to embed in this presentation, but I have to say that would have been the first time I had tried to get a video into a PowerPoint, and it defeated me, even though I looked at 2 or 3 very helpful American how-to clips on the on my computer. But anyway, face transplant, that movie, for those who don't know, turns on the idea that in effect John Travolta and Nicolas Cage, one is a villain and one is a cop, and they kind of swap faces, and as you can imagine, this sort of happens by mistake. All hell breaks loose, and anyone who wants to add to that that synopsis of great literary quality is welcome to after the talk. Now, there's a lot of coverage of the recipients of face transplants, especially in the last few years, and I did discover, somewhat to my disgust, that if you go onto the internet looking for images that could be shown to, well, we just have hit the 9 o'clock threshold. But anyway, the face transplant images I didn't think were suitable for a family occasion. So there is a lot of coverage, though, which you can read about, and this was in the newspapers quite a lot in the last few years, of the recipients of face transplants. And of course, under certain circumstances, to be, again, serious for a moment, it does give literally a new lease of life to people who have either terrible congenital situations or have suffered terrible injuries. There's much less coverage, I found, of the people who donate their faces. Okay, there doesn't seem to be so much information about those, and maybe that has to do with donor anonymity, I don't know. Under a current American law, a donor has to give explicit permission to donate your face, or for that matter, your hands. Those appear to be the 2 aspects of the human body. You can give permission. Oh, I just dropped my blood. You can give permission to have your organs donated, and just say all my organs. Okay, so eyes, kidney, whatever. But if you want to have your face available for transplant, you have to explicitly add that. Okay, and the same with hands. And I think that relationship between face and hands is incredibly interesting, actually, and not least for someone like me who's interested in the history of criminal identification. So, any volunteers? I think these were the ones that I thought were the most apt to finish this talk with. And so, no volunteers, it seems. Okay, then that's where you're all going to end up. Okay.